So when you think of crops like peaches, okra, sweet potatoes, you don't really think of New Hampshire. You don't think of the Northeast. And it's true that the majority of sweet potatoes are grown in southern states. It's a tropical species. So 75% of domestic sweet potato production is in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and North Carolina. But they grow fine up here, and I would actually recommend it would be a great crop for a beginner because of that. It's a really resilient plant. It does great in drought conditions. It's kind of foolproof, and bonus, because there's not a lot of commercial production in our area and relatively few wild hosts living out in your neighborhood, there's very few pests to worry about when you're growing sweet potato in your garden or your farm. If you're a backyard grower, yield doesn't matter. You don't mind having gnarly roots coming out of the ground. You're just happy to get something really nice and tasty. Then there's lots of different options for you. Actually, technically, the ornamental sweet potato vines that people grow in their buckets and their ornamental situations, you can technically dig those up and eat them. They're not all that tasty, but they are edible, which is an exciting thing because they've even bred some new lines of ornamental sweet potato vine that have more delicious roots. Louisiana State Breeding Program has what they call their Treasure Island ornamental varieties, which is really exciting. They're beautiful and they do result in some more delicious roots. Okay, so back to commercial production and large-scale food production of sweet potatoes. The caveat here is that because it's a tropical or subtropical species, it does require a much longer season, 4 to 6 months of frost-free conditions. But New England researchers have been doing plenty of work, and there's plenty of evidence that you can grow a pretty nice commercial crop and get some nice yields, especially if you add some season extension techniques. And by season extension, we're probably talking about black plastic mulch. And I know that's a word that we use often just to mean something that covers the ground, not necessarily a wood mulch, right? So we're talking about a black layer of plastic mulch touching the ground. The solar radiation warms the soil and gives you a little bit longer growing season in the early spring. This note from Becky Seidman's fact sheet on growing sweet potato in New Hampshire, especially for folks who are worried about adding too much plastic to their operation, that sweet potato is particularly well suited to the use of biodegradable mulches that break down during the growing season and don't need to be reused. So at the end of the season, you're probably going to be mowing that crop. So it kind of works out well because it's shredding some of that biodegradable plastic mulch, gets the process going. So what could go wrong? Let's start with the guide. So here we are, the New England Vegetable Management Guide in the sweet potato section. They're pointing out here that sweet potato is not related to Irish potato. That's actually more closely related to like tomato, pepper, eggplant, things like that. Sweet potato is related to morning glory. So you might have morning glory vines in your yard. There's also some really unfortunate weed species in that family. You might have that on your farm or in your backyard. And it is different from yams. This is something I learned reading this. They're in a different family. There's some information here on different varieties. I know Beauregard and Covington are certainly varieties that do very well. They've been rated really well from the researchers at UNH who are doing variety trials. There are white fleshed and purple flesh varieties that are kind of interesting. They have slightly different flavor profiles. I did a lot of research as a graduate student on the eastern shore of Virginia, and that was their big claim to fame, was the white fleshed sweet potatoes. Soil fertility quite low, pH. They do make a note that if you were growing this in heavy clay soils, you might produce irregular roots. That may or may not make any difference to you. And they make a point to say it doesn't need high levels of nitrogen. Again, this is a very resilient crop, so don't over apply nitrogen. They also mentioned that there may be an issue with boron deficiency, result in a disorder called blister. We'll take a look at what that looks like when you harvest those roots. Sweet potatoes are a little bit different from other vegetable crops because you're not necessarily starting them from seed. You're starting them from what they call slips or vine cuttings that have rooted. You can purchase purchase those, and you can also make them yourself. I have found a ton of resources online about how to do that yourself. It's a fun project. If you start with grocery store sweet potatoes, you can certainly do that, but you don't necessarily know what variety they are. No matter which way you decide to go, you're going to be starting from a vegetative source rather than a seed. There's a more susceptibility to having wireworms in the soil if you were turning your backyard lawn into a garden, or if you're using cover crops that have a lot of grasses in it. There's more vulnerability, but they're really hit or miss. It doesn't mean that you're definitely going to have a problem. You're probably not going to have a problem, actually. All right, looking at the section on disease control, they mention a couple diseases that are all soil-borne diseases. So if you are considering variety selection, cultivar selection, and you're looking up information about disease resistance or virus-free stock, you should look for virus-free stock. But most of the considerations you might find online will be targeted towards southern regions, and their main concern in commercial production in southern states is root knot nematode. Don't be worried about that. It's very, very rare here. It has to be transported on soil that is infected with nematodes. You might be familiar with beneficial nematodes. There's a whole world of nematodes out there. These are plant parasitic nematodes. And you'll see from this photo that it is named root knot nematode because it results in these like kind of gnarly looking roots, and the resulting damage in the tuber looks a little bit like this. And you might encounter this at the grocery store. If you cut into one, you might see a little dent like that. But if you're growing them in your own backyard, not to worry, this is not a thing. On the other side of that, our main driver up here would be early maturity. So for example, Beauregard is considered susceptible to root knot nematodes, so maybe not a preferred variety in certain areas down south, but it's an early maturing variety, so it's certainly one we want, and it sounds like it's a pretty delicious variety as well. All right, so you've planted your slips. They are growing well. In some parts of the world, tender shoots of sweet potato are actually harvested as greens, and that's something you could do. So at the vegetative stage, we could be at the harvest stage already. Let me know if that's something that you're interested in. Keep in mind that sweet potato is not related to Irish potato, which is very well defended from herbivory. There's lots of gnarly chemicals in potato foliage, and deer tend to avoid potatoes. That is not the case with sweet potato. Deer really like them. So there is a possibility that you need some kind of deer protection. Electrical fence might keep these deer at bay if you have a big planting of them. There are a few insects that will eat this foliage too, and you'll see some holes and some herbivory above ground. I have some examples from this paper. So I'm just going to show you a picture of sweet potato weevils. They are really only located in southern states, Texas, Louisiana, things like that. We don't have them up here, but any opportunity I have to show anybody a weevil, I'm going to take it. And this guy, apparently above ground feeding does a number on plants to the point where above ground feeding on the leaves will impact the taste flavor profile of the roots. So it'll make them bitter to the point where this is a regulatory pest. There's efforts made to prevent this animal from entering the state of Alabama. But we don't have to worry about it. Now, a couple beetles that we do have in our region so here's a spotted cucumber beetle, and here's a flea beetle. So you will see some above ground injury due to these beetles. Both of these beetles have larval forms that do feed on roots below ground, and they can sometimes cause problems. I doubt that you will see anything like that, so let's not worry about those. So, you'll see a couple holes from these beetles, but nothing to worry about. So another weird one is tortoiseshell beetle. I definitely see tortoiseshell beetle on sweet potato. I've seen this in New Hampshire causing quite a bit of damage. And as a group, these beetles are absolutely beautiful. Take a look at how shiny and pretty they are. They don't even look real. So the larvae themselves are really remarkable. They have these kind of interesting protrusions from them. But they do this thing, they call it a fecal shield, and they are protecting themselves by holding a big hunk of poop above their heads. That's supposed to be protecting them from birds and other predatory type things. Interesting. So what does the damage look like? I found this nice blog post from the folks up in Nova Scotia, and you'll see the larvae will do this kind of window painting. So they're eating the undersides of the leaves and not eating all the way through. You see the little spiky larvae and their fecal shields. I think the adult feeding will go all the way through. So this is the typical feeding that I will often see. The general thinking is that the plants will grow through this, nothing to worry about, but it's unclear as to how much this kind of defoliation impacts yield. So when do you harvest? With potatoes, usually you'll see that potato vine go down and there's some kind of physiological indication. For the most part, you harvest sweet potato when you're ready to at the end of the year, or if there is a killing frost, right? So if you start seeing black leaves, that is time to dig up those roots and harvest. Because the skin of these roots is really thin and these roots can be really sensitive and easily damaged during harvest, something commercial growers will do is, if they can schedule it, they will mow those vines about 10 to 14 days ahead of harvest, and that will help the skin toughen up. So as long as the soil isn't too wet, think about cutting those back a couple of weeks before you're going to harvest. And after you dig up those roots, this is probably where you're going to find the most problems. This is where you're going to find out that things went wrong. Again, there's nothing you can do about it at this point, but in order to identify what could have caused your problem and make plans for the next year, here's a couple things that you might encounter. So we mentioned voles. I think if you have any kind of teeth mark, you are pretty sure that's going to be a mammal. We talked about blister being a boron deficiency. So this is just a nutritional thing. This is just a physiological thing. This is not due to any kind of pathogen. It's not pretty, but there's nothing wrong with this. This should store just fine. There's a couple soil-borne diseases that might result in rots that might lead to some problems in storage down the road. So if you see any kind of soft spots, indentations, white stuff growing on that is a sign that you have a fungal pathogen. I would just toss that rather than store it with other good ones. But there's certainly some insect damage, like wireworm damage, that can cause holes, and that might be an entry point into some storage pathogens that you might want to worry about. But there's nothing wrong with these. You can eat them, no problem. It's just a matter of making sure that all your storage roots are being stored together. Curing is an important part of growing sweet potatoes. So the curing process is what heals up any of the wounds that might have happened in the soil. It thickens up the skin. It gets them ready for long-term storage. Long-term storage should be at room temperature. Never put your sweet potatoes in the fridge. They just don't do well at temperatures below 50 degrees. There might be some signs of chill injury, kind of like this. So to cure these roots, for 4 days, 7 days, you're holding them at a relatively high humidity. So 85 to 95% humidity at temperatures between 80 to 80s. And then you can store them throughout the whole winter and have access to that. Again, room temperature, 60 to 75% relative humidity, 55 to 60 degrees would be ideal, but as long as it's not below 50. The best thing to do is to store them for at least 3 weeks before you really start to enjoy them. What happens is the starches in those roots convert to sugars and they become much more delicious. Again, you can eat them right after you harvest them, but it's not going to be the same delicious experience as if you let those starches convert to sugars. So easy peasy. I would go ahead, recommend trying it if you're looking for something new and exciting and really hardy to grow as a vegetable crop. Go for it. Let me know what you want to know more about, what kind of pests might be causing you issues with this. So let me know. Thanks for listening.